during after the end of the Cold War, this idea of hegemony came, control everything, influence the world, divide the world into areas of influence. And it's not only expanding influence. It was a declaration of war because there was a concept developed by these guys to contain those who can compete, or at least who can share something in the global scene. That was not allowed.
You say the U.S. should openly support regime change in Eritrea. That's pretty bold and direct. What was missing for the U.S. not to have acted in favor of regime change before, and how likely is it now for the new Trump administration to act on your recommendations?
Well, I hate to say one of the reasons why the United States hasn't acted on this is simply because the United States traditionally, both under Republicans and Democrats, too often ignores Africa and African issues. The reason why it's becoming more important now, however, is twofold. Number one, we're coming to the end of Isaias's time in office anyway. I mean, he can avoid elections, but he can't avoid aging. And the fact of the matter is he's already had a stroke and he's coming to the end of his life. So number one, we've got to be prepared. Number two, the human rights situation in Eritrea is grave and growing. Now, some people within the Trump administration and in the United States would say that's Eritrea's problem. It doesn't impact the United States. But there are a number of follow-on effects from the human rights situation as we have it now. And the same networks that provide human trafficking also provide transit for terrorists. And it's the same criminal networks, the same criminal gangs. That's number one. Refugee flows we see can be very destabilizing throughout the region. That's number two. And the third reason is because with the Red Sea becoming increasingly important, the United States can no longer afford to ignore what's happening. Now, personally, I favor the human rights approach. What's happening in Eritrea is tragic, and it's long overdue that the United States act. The fact of the matter is, Eritrea could be the pearl of the region. It could be a fabulously wealthy country for all Eritreans, not just the ruling family. Especially given the education of Eritreans, given the human capital, given the location of Asmara. And there's absolutely no reason why Eritrea can't shine, and the United States should be its partner as it does.
Important. I think people need to take very seriously this neoconservative attitude about the world, which really at this point exists in both parties. But the neocons, they always make a comeback, and they have this good and evil view of the world that doesn't actually have any basis in reality in terms because there's no such thing as good and evil. That's just a very black and white view of the world, but it's a very convenient view of the world that literally just places any country in the category of evil for showing any defiance whatsoever to U.S. dictates. That's it. That's all it is. All of this talk about human rights, God, the propaganda is so real on that issue, but it's not, the U.S. does not care. Certainly neoconservatives do not care. And when they're talking about overthrowing governments and collapsing states, that is a very violent act. It kills hundreds of thousands to millions of people to do something like that. So anybody professing to want to do that in the name of human rights is full of BS. And it's a scary prospect because these sorts of people, they have ears of the powerful. They have a say in both sides or both parties that control U.S. empire. And I just want to point out to kind of, in the, pattern of what you're talking about with Eritrea, there's an article by Brett Stevens at the New York Times from yesterday. Literally, the title is "Depose Maduro," and the whole article is about how the Donald Trump administration should make one of their priorities the overthrow of Nicolas Maduro, the recently reelected president of Venezuela. And he says through coercive diplomacy, if possible, or force if necessary. I mean, these people are the arrogance, the mafia-like arrogance of these people is so extreme. They live in such a delusional fantasy world where they think they can just pick off entire countries full of millions of people. if they don't like the people who are in power in those countries. And they do it in this framework of human rights that, again, should be completely rejected. So I appreciate that you explained all of that, because this is a serious threat to actual people, like millions of people who.
Just to go on to the human rights aspect of it, you probably know that Siham Ali, a U.S. citizen, has been jailed by the regime for more than 12 years. She was jailed when she was 15, and 2 U.S. employees also disappeared about 20 years ago. What would it take to have President Trump issue "there will be hell to pay" warning unless Siham and all U.S. citizens are freed immediately? Could this be a trigger point for the regime change idea that you're advocating?
The answer is absolutely yes. We've seen under Trump version 1.0 that Trump, for example, promised to bring down the Turkish economy if they didn't release American pastor Andrew Brunson. And with just a few tariffs on steel, Trump managed to achieve his relief without paying any ransom. The problem, realistically, is that under Isaias, Eritrea has become so poor that there's just very little leverage economically and in terms of sanctions. That said, when we see how the Eritrean royal ruling family steals money and takes it abroad, that really is the point of leverage we have. If we can help the Eritrean people repossess the money which the Isaias and his family have stolen, that is something that, I mean, frankly, Isaias would never want to deal with. He sees himself as a king. He sees himself as an empire, an emperor. He sees himself as someone who should be fabulously wealthy, a billionaire. He doesn't care about his people. So the fact of the matter is, we need to go after Isaias and Isaias personally.
And anyone who follows Eritrea, you know, or honestly any country where there's regime change, same basic story. It's evil, it's a dictatorship, there's all these bad things, and now is the great opportunity for America to bring freedom and democracy to Eritrea. So this is actually a long-running issue. Eritrea is under sanctions, it's been under sanctions. There's consistent sort of calls from people like Michael Rubin, but in a context where, you know, you may have a kind of tabula rasa type situation in the Trump administration, you know, I think it can be particularly dangerous because these things can kind of sneak in, if you will, if there's not necessarily awareness of what's going on. And I want to raise it for a couple of reasons that I think are very important for people to recognize why this is a bad idea. I mean, first and foremost, we're talking about Eritrea, which is in the Horn of Africa, which is already one of the parts of the world that is the most war-torn. I mean, Sudan, which we talked about earlier on this show, Ethiopia, which has numerous running conflicts, Somalia, which has numerous running conflicts, you know, an area of the world where people have been intensely suffering due to many different wars, interventions, sanctions, most of which have their roots, by the way, in sort of imperial policy to shape and control the Horn of Africa because it's so geostrategically important. It sits right there in the Suez Canal, on the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Indian Ocean. And so going well back into the, you know, the 1800s, this has been one of the main areas for imperialists to try to control, and it often destabilized. So Eritrea is essentially the only country in the region that has any stability whatsoever. I mean, it's very stable, actually. It's the only stable country that's not really being racked by a war right now, a civil war, a really bad one in many different cases. And undoubtedly, any attempt at regime change in Eritrea would destabilize that country, because this is a country that, like many countries that are targeted for regime change, whatever critiques people have, there are many people who support the current government and undoubtedly would stand up and push back against regime change, which means the country would be torn apart. So a region that is already suffering, you know, unimaginable horrors from destabilization, sanctions, different regime change efforts that have existed would be sunk even deeper into the mire, and the people of Eritrea and the surrounding countries could only suffer any more. So in the same way we look at Iraq, in the same way we look at Libya, in the same way we look at all of these different countries, this effort in general, just beyond anything else, to try to ask for and push for regime change in Eritrea by elements that are, you know, in the Republican Party, so they feel like they can influence Trump, is very, very dangerous for African people in the Horn of Africa.
In fact, I want to focus on one paragraph in your article where you say the money Isaias and his cronies have stolen and sent abroad should be identified, seized, and placed in a fund that a provisional Eritrean government can utilize and apply to the country's reconstruction. I mean, great idea. As you know, and as you mentioned earlier, the regime runs various embezzlement schemes. It tripled or quadrupled the foreign revenue currency that it gets by just changing the local currency. No matter how much money you have in the bank, you can only withdraw $300 a month. There is no sign Eritrea's gold revenues have trickled down to benefit the local economy. In fact, Isaias boasts how thoroughly he has destroyed the country and its economy, a hand-to-mouth economy, as he puts it, with contempt. I can go on. So what tools and resources can Eritreans and friends of Eritrea use to find and recover the stolen money, as he put it?
Well, you know, this is really the job of the U.S. Treasury Department. Now, too often, when we think about U.S. foreign policy, people think about the U.S. State Department, the equivalent of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They think about the Pentagon, the Defense Department. But in reality, some of the most effective actions we see occur with regard to the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Now, they have the ability to basically trace funds, to trace monies, and are the best able to identify where these monies are going overseas. And so what it will take is someone in the National Security Council, National Security Advisor, for example, Mike Waltz, or the incoming Undersecretary of State for Africa, Peter Pham, to basically say at a National Security Council meeting, this needs to be our priority. We need to, from above, tell the U.S. government that when it comes to Eritrea, they need to track every single dollar that's coming in and out of the country. And if it means putting liens on individuals and their houses and so forth, that's fine too. I would also go further and say one strategy that might be taken in the United States is what's called a RICO suit, a racketeering suit. This is what brought down the mafia. And the key with a RICO suit, RICO, if any of your audience wants to Google it, is that everyone involved in the scheme is presumed equally guilty. And therefore, they have a choice. They can either turn state's evidence and start giving evidence against those involved in the criminal scheme, or they will suffer the same consequences, losing their house, losing their money, losing their livelihood, being put in prison. And the question is, how many within the diaspora, for example, in the United States, really want to spend their life in prison because Isaias Afwerki wants to be a billionaire? Right.
So the U.S. embassies, the Eritrean embassies in the U.S. or in Europe and Canada are involved in collecting a 2% tax, as they call it. How liable are they personally, and what can be done, to basically stop the embezzlement schemes they've been continuing to do for years and years?
First of all, let me say that the 2% tax is illegal according to United Nations Security Council resolutions. Let me also say that the United States taxes our own expatriates. I will say that that is extremely bad policy on the part of the United States, and we should not do it. But when Eritreans will say, people who are representing the government, that the that the Americans do it and there's no difference to what the Eritrean government is doing, that's simply false. There's no equivalence. What the Americans are doing are taxing our citizens. And if our citizens give up their citizenship, they no longer need to pay the tax. What the Eritreans are doing are taxing people based on their ethnicity or former nationality. And they're doing it, it's more of an extortion scheme. Once you pay the money, you are forced to join specific organizations where you have to pay further dues. So it's a continuing extortion scheme. The fact of the matter is that the United States shouldn't participate in the 2% and should target those legally who are doing so on American soil or European soil. We also need, and this goes to your previous question, to start sanctioning the Eritrean banks, which act as basically criminal recipients of these sorts of money. And I mentioned this in my article. That really is the next step. Targeting the Eritrean banks, both sanctioning them as entities of a terrorist or criminal enterprise, and then establishing criminal liability for anyone who sends money to them. And then you can allow the Eritrean diaspora to decide whether it really is worth it, given that they would be violating racketeering or anti-terrorist laws should they fund Eritrean banks.
One of the challenges could be the money could be hidden, I don't know, in places where it's not accessible, China, Russia. What can the U.S. Treasury do in terms of tracing, that kind of the deposits where they may be in Chinese or Russian banks or something like that?
Look, I mean, honestly, it's quite difficult, but we've seen cases where this has occurred before. A number of countries have returned money that was stolen by Iraqis and sent to Dubai and Lebanon. And you know that both Dubai and Lebanon can be very, very difficult when it comes to issues of financial transparency. And yet the Iraqis post-2003 succeeded in this. Cyprus and Armenia have both gotten off the money laundering lists by basically turning state's evidence and becoming far less opaque than they used to be. So too have the Cayman Islands. And when that doesn't work, we see issues such as we've seen with the Panama Papers, where specific leaks can become involved. Now, if countries like China and Russia won't play ball, what you do have is an ability with regard to reputational risk, where some of their companies who want to deal on the world stage are going to be very reticent to be tied to this sort of scheme. The question then becomes for the Russians or the Chinese, would you rather hide Azaeus' money, or would you rather do business with the rest of the world, but you can't do both? That's how the U.S. Treasury Department works. That's how financial sanctions work. And that's why it may be difficult to identify and compel the return of some money, but it is possible to wage economic warfare, not against the Eritreans, but against the Azaeus family, because make no mistake, the returned money comes not to the United States. It comes to funding Eritrea so that it can build itself into the Singapore it deserves to be, rather than the North Korea on the Red Sea.
Right. As you know, Eritrea has been destroying its human capital for decades. Basically wasting millions of man years of productivity. So if a system collapse happens before Eritreans are organized properly, all kinds of bad actors can rush in to fill the vacuum. For example, mercenary armies like the Wagner Group, super rich Gulf states, desperate neighbors, and even feuding local warlords. What is your advice for Eritreans inside and outside the country on how to build the necessary alliances with the US and others to prevent such scenarios from happening and increase the chances for Eritreans to own their destiny?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Eritrea is not alone. In 2006, I traveled to Gdansk, Poland, for a conference marking the 25th anniversary of the Solidarity movement. Lech Walesa, who had gone from a labor leader in opposition to being the president of Poland, was there. So too were Cubans, Zimbabweans, and all sorts of peoples from other countries, both those which have had successful democratic revolutions and those that had yet to do so at the time. And what they were all talking about was lessons learned. So, for example, when the change comes, we know this, and we've seen this with Syria. When the change comes, it's going to come much faster than anyone expects, whether it's Isaias and his family or whether it's the Eritrean people. And it's important now to actually form the networks so that you can fill the vacuums, so that you can think not only about the evils of Isaias Afwerki and why he deserves to hang from the gallows, but instead talk about how you are going to repair the education system, how you're going to repair commerce, how you're going to repair free trade, how you're going to prevent a situation like what happened in Russia in 1991, where you had rise of oligarchs distort the economy. These are the discussions which should be being had in all sorts of countries outside Eritrea now, because the Eritrean diaspora is incredibly strong, is incredibly able, and they can learn the lessons learned from other states that have failed in this transition, skip a few steps, and really enrich their next generation with equity and with justice.
Right.